From the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina, this is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, presented by A Cloud Guru, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. You know, one of the big topics that we hear a lot about in the news and in the technology press kind of day in and day out these days as we're into 2018 is artificial intelligence. And while there's all sorts of stories about the coolness of the technology and sometimes some scare stuff worried about, will we ever have jobs in 10 years and so forth. I think the reality is AI is starting to become a really big part of kind of everything we do day to day. And sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't. Sometimes it becomes embedded into the technologies that we live with day to day. And today I'm really excited because I got a notice a couple of weeks ago about a company that I like to follow and keep up with. And one of the things that it mentioned was that they were embedding AI into one of their new services. And I thought, I want to go dig into that some more, get back into what's going on. So very excited to have Srinivas Krishnamurti, and I always butcher your name, so I apologize, SK, CEO of Zugata. Welcome back to the show. Good to hear from you.
Hey, Brian, how are you? Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, it's been a while. I thought it had been less than that. It's been almost a year and a half. Give us an update on Zugata and the things that you're doing around self-improvement as a service.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be on your show. And I think we talked probably when we actually launched the company a little while ago. Since then, obviously, a lot of things have happened. But Zugata is in the performance management space. And I think the vision for Zugata has always been that, if you look at traditional performance reviews, they've always been a way to kind of look back at your past performance and give you a grade for it, which was tied to your merit increase or whatever, your bonus or what have you, right? Mm-hmm. It was always a way to look back.
Right.
And grade your past performance. And that's the process that everybody hates, right? I mean, I probably talked to, I'd say, over 2,500 companies since starting Zugata. And not once did anybody say, we actually like that annual review process. I think in next to filing expense reports, this is probably the most hated thing that we have to do at work,
Right.
And so it's just broadly, performance management has just been something that everybody does, because HR needs us to do it, but nobody sees any value in it. And it's such a missed opportunity. So we've started Zugata to basically say, look, let's make performance management a more strategic initiative. And we can do that if we can focus on what the employees want, right? And the employees really, wake up each morning and they don't come to work saying, I'm going to suck today, right? Nobody thinks that way, right? Everybody comes to work, saying, I want to be better than I was yesterday. I want to get better. I want to get promoted, right? I want to develop,
Right.
And so we are reimagining performance management to be something that is more focused on improving performance rather than just measuring your past performance, right? Yep. And so we can proactively help you get better. Then as an employee, you feel like you're getting something out of the process. And so that's been the biggest focus for us. And so we've been doing that, signed up a whole bunch of customers, things going really well. And as you alluded to earlier, we launched a new initiative a couple of weeks ago that's more focused on not just looking at the individual and helping them get better, but also looking at the organization itself and trying to understand the org itself and trying to figure out how can we help the org get better, the organization get better. Because the thing that we've learned is that individual performance is in the context of the environment in which people work, right? So the environment in which you work actually impacts your performance. And so far, traditionally in the HR space, everybody's thought about performance management just at the individual level, and nobody's really thought about, hey, what impact does the environment have on individual performance? So we're introducing this notion of organizational performance management, where we can understand things about the organization and kind of tweak that such that people in the organization can do their best work. So that's a new initiative. So we're holistically thinking about performance management as a way to help companies create high performance cultures. Right? That's the way we've been thinking about it. And that's resonating really well. We've got a bunch of customers signed up. So things are going really well, man.
Good. Excellent to hear. We always we love to hear that the companies that we talked to when they launched are doing well and continuing to thrive. When I saw the Insights announcement, it first and foremost, we want to dive into some stuff about AI that's sort of behind the scenes, but it was kind of a bold statement, because in essence, what you're saying is, like you said, we don't just want to kind of measure individuals. We want to look at, how do we improve the company, right? Be value adding to the company. And you really, you set out with some bold goals. You wanted to improve company culture. You wanted to eliminate gender bias. You wanted to sort of better understand the skills of top attributes or top performers, and hopefully, figure out how to pass those along to other people. How is that received? Because I think a lot of times companies assume like it's their job to drive culture and so forth. Are they appreciative of a tool that's going to further give them insight to hopefully move towards those things?
Yeah, I mean, each of those things are actually pretty big ticket items, right? I mean, if you think about culture, that's a huge multi-headed monster, right? I mean, and I think, when we talk to CHROs, the thing that they always tell us is, look, we all realize the importance of culture, right? There's a lot of research out there that says, look, if you have a good culture, success will come and all that, the
Right.
numbers will all add up, Nobody's going to argue that, a strong culture is not needed, right? But the thing that CHROs have always struggled with is, how do you actually measure the culture? How do you know? It's one thing for us to say, hey, here are the cultural values that this company cares about, right? And we'll put it up on our website, we'll put it up on the intranet, we'll maybe even print some poster boards and put them in the kitchens and all that stuff. And that's the easy part, right? But then are we actually walking the walk? How do you measure that, right? That's something that companies have always kind of struggled with. And so the fact that we're giving them the tools to be able to track and measure this for the first time is a great first step. They're like, okay, now I know where we're at. And if I know that, then I know what I can do to actually make it better. How can I align it with what I really want it to be? How do we make sure we're walking the walk and talking the talk, right? As close as possible. And so people are pretty receptive to that. And then on the gender bias, it's actually very, very timely, because there's just so much going on, not just in tech, but just across the entire, corporate world in terms of diversity and inclusion, right? And a lot of the focus has been on, hey, let's make sure we have more women in engineering or more minorities, more about just the numbers, right? About diversity. Mm-hmm. But we're thinking beyond that and saying, okay, well, it's great to have more women and more minorities and all that, but is your culture inclusive, right? Will these people be heard? Because if they're not going to be heard, they're not going to stick around, right? And so how do you measure that? How do you create a culture where such people can actually express themselves and feel like they're being heard? How do you measure that? How do you measure gender bias? And not just gender bias, so that's the first thing that we're doing. But even beyond that, right? Is there age bias, right? Is there ethnicity bias? And all these biases, exist. So how do you actually measure all this stuff? Is something that we're doing. So that's actually, the feedback that we've been getting is that it's very timely, and it's something that is massively useful for companies as they think about, all the different initiatives that they have in place to, around D&I or just, improving their culture and things like that. It seems like it's the right time for them.
Right, and I imagine if this is being embedded as a technology tool, you're going to get that feedback more frequently, right? So instead of for me as I've been a manager over the years and had teams and staffs and stuff, one of the things that has always been frustrating is, you want to have kind of constant communication with your team, not just once a year. But the tools really weren't there to kind of have anything but just, hey, we'll have a one-on-one meeting, we'll jot some notes down. But there really was never a way for people to have a sense of, well, where do I stand? Or, even worse, get to the end of the year, do a review, have to fit somebody in a bell curve. And then you're like, well, we've been having great conversations all year, but sorry, you fit in the average because that's the way the bell curve is. I have to imagine more frequent data points gives, more leeway and latitude as to how companies can adjust their culture and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, just like our performance, a number doesn't define our performance, right? I mean, that's one of the things that everybody complain about is in the typical performance review at the end of the year, they say, okay, you're a 3 or a 4 or whatever the label is attached to that rating, And people are like, look, I'm a lot more, complex than just a number. You can't just wrap everything that I've done into one number, right? And that's the thing that people have always struggled with. And the same thing with culture and gender bias and all these things too. It's you cannot just give a number, right? It's not one score, right? And I think as you pointed out, it's also one of these things where it keeps changing over time, right? I mean, culture evolves. Your culture is never the same, right? there's always inflection points where things change. And just from my own VMware days, right, as I kind of reflect on, I was pretty early at VMware, I think I was like employee 250 or something like that, at VMware.
Yep. And
that one was about 16,000 people. And it's interesting how the culture of the company changes over that period of time, In the early days, there was just a lot more focus on like, hey, innovation, right? You've got to anybody who's got an idea, you could just like pitch it and get it done quick, And once the company gets to a certain stage, once it gets big enough, big companies always tend to like want to protect against failures, right? So there's a lot of checks and balances in place. So you can't be as much as, as a cowboy. Like you can't just like get any random idea built, right? It's just much harder because we have all these things in place that protect from failure. And obviously, the values and what we reward kind of changes over time as well. And that's reflected in the cultural values. So it's also interesting to realize that a lot of these things always kind of evolve over time. So it's not a once a year, it's not a once every couple of years or once in 6 months. It's always something that you want to be to track and kind of fine tune and make sure that it is as close to what you want it to be,
Right. No, excellent. That's excellent. Hey, I want to shift gears a little bit, sort of from the thing that people see from a Zugata perspective to sort of what's behind the scenes. And one of the things that jumped out at me when I saw the Insights announcement was really a focus on, AI powered, insights and AI powered sort of trends of what's going on. And one of the things that I hear from a lot of different companies, just talking to them about technology, talking about them about trends, is a lot of them will go, there seems to be a lot of cool stuff that you can do with AI, whatever aspect of it they think is cool. And then they go, how do I add that to an application? Or how do I add that into something that we do? And so I'm curious if you can maybe help us at a high level. How did you go about adding sort of AI capabilities into a service that already existed?
Yeah, I mean, I think even before we talk about the tech, right, it's important for us to talk about like what problem you're trying to solve, right? And we're in the HR space where our typical HR buyers are not like tech geeks, right? I mean, they've got a whole bunch of things that they're worried about, and the last thing that they're going to get excited is whether using AI or BI or CI. They don't really care, right? Yep. So the way we've always thought about it is what problem are we trying to solve? Right. And what is the best way to solve that problem? Right. And oftentimes, like, as you pointed out, AI is so hot. Everybody's like, OK, let's start with AI and figure out, what we can do. And then we can figure out what the use case is. And we've kind of shied away from that, the flavor of the month kind of a thing, And we've always gone back to first principles and said, look, what is it? What is it that we're trying to solve? And what's the best way to solve that? And whether that means we use machine learning or whatever, then let's do that. But let's not kind of flip that and say, hey, we want to do machine learning and then kind of figure out what it is that we can do, Okay. And so I think in that context, especially with HR as a buyer, we didn't want to nerd out and say, hey, here are all the cool things that we can do, because they don't really care, right? Right. It all comes down to what is the problem that you're trying to solve. And secondly, the way we've also thought about it is this has to be done in a seamless way where people don't even realize that you're doing machine learning or using AI or whatever it is, You're just giving them something interesting that, is actionable, that's useful for them, that helps them run their business better. But what's happening underneath the covers is completely irrelevant, right? So that's the first thing. Right. And so in our case, what we said is, look, our mission is really to build a high-performance culture. And in order to do that, obviously, individuals need to get better. And that's what we've been focusing on. But at the same time, the environment in which they work should also be optimized to get the best out of their people, right? That was kind of the way we've thought about what we're setting out to do. And then when we thought about, okay, what does organizational performance management mean? What are the environmental variables that impact the performance of an individual in that company? We identified a whole bunch of things, right? And we're trying to knock off, one in each release. And so the first three that we picked for the initial launch of our product was, hey, the culture of a company has a huge impact on people. And whether you're being included or not, how inclusive, how safe you feel at work will also impact your performance. And so we kind of started off with that as kind of the marching orders and said, okay, from all the data that we have, what insights can we draw to help a company understand its culture, understand how inclusive that culture is, right? And that's the way we kind of, walked into doing AI. And so I think that's one thing that, I would caution listeners, as they think about adding AI into their products, is to always go back to, hey, what is the customer problem that you're trying to solve? And if you don't have a good feel for that, don't just, jump on the AI bandwagon and just do something for the sake of doing it, because it just won't work.
Right. Yeah. Get back to first principles. Why are you in business to begin with, and sort of work from there, and makes a ton of sense. Now, Now you're in Silicon Valley, so I think the answer is going to be a little bit skewed in terms of talent. But give us a sense of maybe partially the tech, but also the resources, the development resources needed to sort of be adding this type of technology. Is it are they becoming more commonplace? Are they still difficult to hire for? Is it still super competitive? What's the landscape out there?
It's all of the above, Brian, unfortunately. I think it is, so it requires, different skills, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, computer science is a very broad topic and people kind of specialize in, all kinds of different things. And so for us, we've had to build out a data science team in order to do a lot of the stuff. So we have a bunch of PhDs in computer science from Carnegie Mellon who are part of our data science team. So we had to hire those guys from, and build out that team. And that's hard, man. I mean, these, especially if you're in the Bay Area, right? I mean, Google and Facebook and all these guys are doing really interesting work, right? And they pay a ton of money, right?
Right.
So you're competing for folks, with the likes of companies like that. So it's always hard. But at the same time, the thing that we can offer, these folks is the fact that if they join somebody like us, the amount of influence that they have and the impact that they have is going to be so much more than just being a small cog in the wallet, in the wheel in some of these big companies. So that's our starting point. But certainly it's wicked hard to find good people, right? And data itself, I mean, the data science area itself is it's not new, but it's a specialized skill set. So there aren't that many people with that, right? Mm-hmm. So it took us a while to build it out, and we've been working on this for almost a year before we actually announced our Zugata Insights product.
Okay.
So it takes a while. It's not easy, starting with hiring the right team. And we've actually had a couple of back-end guys who switched over into the data science team. Okay. And so that helped a little bit. But we just need to get some extra bodies in there who knew, we do a lot of natural language processing, type stuff, right? Where we have algorithms that kind of parse written text and make sense out of it. And so that's a skill set, that let's say your front-end developers, they just don't have that,
Sure.
And so we have to hire people with that kind of background. So that takes a while. And then once you actually start doing the work, I mean, it's a lot of trial and error. I mean, it's not easy. And just the amount of training, that we had to do to the algorithms to get them to a level where we felt comfortable with the accuracy at which they were working. It's a lot of iterations. It takes a lot of work, a lot of data as well. Yep. And so it took us almost a year, man, to get to a state where we feel like we have something to announce and feel like, hey, we feel good about what this thing does,
Yep. Now, do you guys feel like that's where the heavy lifting is in terms of, sort of identifying or building the tech stack versus data collection, trials, training the system? Is the training, data collection portion really the heavy lifting in terms of just amount of time it takes and iterative cycles to figure out if you're right, or is there still a lot of work to just figure out the tech stack in terms of maturity?
It's both. I think what I was talking to our team before this call. And what they were saying is, look, for small parts of the work that we're doing, there's a bunch of open source code out there that you can start with, right? Mm-hmm. That only gets you 10, 20, 30% of the way there. Okay. In one case, for one of the things that we're doing, what the team was telling me is that, look, they could have picked, any algorithm that's out there in open source, already for a couple of years that was built with a different context in mind, not necessarily in the context in which we're going to be using it, right? Right. So you can start with that. But we had to string together 11 different, packages or algorithms to get to what we wanted to get at, right? Wow. And so you can bits and pieces from elsewhere, but how do you string them together in a way that makes sense for the training set that you have and the field that you're in is important. And then once you get all this, stuff together, then you got to train that system, right? Because it doesn't know anything about HR. It doesn't know anything about, the field that we're in. And that's where we spent a lot of time training the data and training the algorithms to make sure that, they're getting good at learning. That's where the machine learning stuff comes in, right? And just tweaking the algorithms a little bit to make sure that we're getting really good at, identifying things that we need to identify, and kind of also teaching the algorithm so that it can actually get better at finding the right things as well. And all that takes a ton of time. Gotcha.
No, that makes sense. And I think it gives us a sense of kind of where the maturity of this is. I mean, we all see a lot of things that, are very cool and are in a demonstration somewhere. But, like you said, in order to really get it into a context that is specific for what you're trying to do, train it up, learn it up so that, ultimately, if your end customer is not going to be a data scientist, it has to be somebody who just says, I just want to go to a screen, type some things, and make stuff work. It's good to get a sense of how much of the uplift is needed to make that happen. Now, let me. Go ahead.
Topic too. It all depends on the context, right? I mean,
sure.
So let's say you're trying to do something about parsing movie reviews to make sense of how good the movie is, right?
Right.
If that's the space that you're in, there's a bunch of algorithms that you can download and probably do something very quickly, right? That's not hard, right?
Yep.
But I think making it more contextual to the stuff that you're in, the space that you're in, I think is it doesn't translate easily,
Right. Yeah. No, and that makes sense. It's there are certain things that are horizontal, but the more vertical you get, the more expertise and specialty you absolutely have to have. And that goes across any industry. It's not just in HR. Let me ask you one last question, and I think this will be an interesting topic. We see a lot of AI mentioned around kind of non-human centric things. So algorithms that are trying to do electronic trading, maybe things that are driving autonomous cars. They don't really necessarily impact sort of human feelings. There's not a human emotion element that you get into. You really sort of buy or sell, stop or go. How much more complicated did your team, feel that it was to start to do this around things that were more human-centric as opposed to kind of non-human-centric decision-making and calculations and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, all these things are hard, right? None of them are easy.
Sure.
But I think it just adds an extra couple dimensions of complexity when you have to understand human emotion, right? I mean, the thing that we do is we look at all the feedback that's been written about people, right? And trying to parse through what people have written about you to understand, hey, what are the attributes of behaviors that people are talking about when they write about you, right? Are they talking about you being a great communicator or you're good at, getting stuff done or whatever it is, right? We're trying to understand that based on how, what's written. And everybody writes differently, right? And so there's a little bit of complexity there. There's sarcasm that you have to account for, right? There's sentiment, there's positive and negative, things that they say about you. So how do you make sense of hey, they're actually talking about Brian in a positive way when they're talking about this versus they have a negative way of talking about the same skill,
Yep.
So you need to understand that as well. And so it just adds, multiple levels of complexity to the algorithms that we had to write. But it's all hard, man. And I think, there's certain times when, when we're doing some, training to test our algorithms, there have been instances where we've said, well, why did it pick that as a keyword or as a behavioral attribute of Brian? And it's really hard to go back and figure out why that was picked because it's so complicated. I mean, it's hard for a human mind to take that many things into consideration and make sense out of it. So oftentimes we can't even quite figure out why all these algorithms working together gave us this as the answer.
Right.
And so that just makes it a little bit more complicated as well. But that's just the way it is. I mean, this is really complicated stuff. And it's a bit scary where you feel like this is probably the first time where the machines probably know more than you do or more than what your mind can actually even grasp,
Yeah.
And
well,
so it's
yeah, and you're trying to parse out the nuance between criticism and constructive criticism. And I'm sure there are, regional ways that people can, if I've had conversations with people from Boston that you feel like are the most harsh conversations you have. And it's like, no, that's just their regular day-to-day tone versus something else. And having to parse all those things out, make sense of them. I'm sure the amount of insight that you're getting is fantastic. And while everybody would like it to be perfect right out of the bat, it's going to improve over time. It's, the whole thing of these systems is the more data they get, the more intelligence they get, or the ability to sort of retrain them. So, it'll be sort of a fascinating thing to track. So give us a sense of where, the product launched here just, a couple of months ago. Where are you along the path of, are you getting, good feedback from people? Are people beginning to start to understand what it can do for them, or how's it going so far?
Yeah, so far so good. We've already done this kind of analysis for a couple of our customers and shared that with them. And we've got a bunch of pretty big customers in the pipeline wanting to do this stuff for them. So we're just lining up a bunch of these things. But it's interesting. Even with what we have, we were studying one of our customers, and we were doing a bunch of gender bias analysis for them. And what we found was really interesting. We were looking at 3 or 4 different departments in their company. And looking at, the way we measure gender bias is we look at the feedback that's been written about, all the people in your department. We pick out the list of attributes that people are using to describe you, right?
Right.
And then we say, okay, well, we dedupe these attributes as well, right? Because somebody could say, hey, Brian is a strong communicator. And somebody else could say, well, Brian is really good at communicating. They're roughly the same, right? And so how do you dedupe them is an interesting part of our work. So we've done that. And then we say, okay, well, 2 people talked about Brian's communication skills. So we have a frequency for each of these attributes in terms of how often they were mentioned when people talked about you. So we have that for everybody in the organization. And so for gender bias, what we then do is we look at all the feedback that's been written about men, and we look at the feedback that's been written about women in terms of the attributes that they use to describe them. Mm-hmm. And then we categorize each of those attributes that we found as either related to their work or related to their personality.
Okay.
Right. And so what we found with one of our customers is we said, let's go look at each of these departments. And so, in engineering, it was, there didn't seem like there was that much of a difference between what percentage of the feedback was about their work versus personality. But in one of the departments, what we found is that when men got feedback, about 68% of the feedback was about the work, and about 30% was about their personality. Mm-hmm. And in that same department, when we looked at women, almost 50% of the feedback was about the personality, and less than 50% was about the work.
Interesting.
And so, if you think about that, right? And so we said, well, that's kind of interesting. There's just a big gap between, how feedback is being written about men and women. And so we dug into it a little bit more. And what we found is that when we looked at the feedback that was most commonly used to describe high performers, men who are high performers in that group, the top most commonly used attribute was that they had awesome job knowledge, right? They knew exactly what the job was about, and they're really good at doing their job. And then when we looked at the high-performing women in that group and looked at their feedback, the most commonly used one was that they were well-organized.
Interesting.
Right? And so we're like, that's kind of goofy, right? And then well-organized was not in the top 5 for men, and superior job knowledge was not in the top 5 for women. And we're like, okay, these people are all in the same department and roughly doing similar work. How can you have such vastly different filters to describe successful people, right? Something is off, And so we're able to identify things like that makes you just kind of take a step back and figure out, okay, what is going on here? Something is off,
Right.
And that's the first time that this company actually got that kind of data. And so they're like, okay, well, we'll need to look into this and figure out what's going on, because this is not certainly what is expected. And at the same time, there's research out there that says, look, when women get feedback, a lot of the feedback is very vague and it's not constructive, right? It doesn't really help them, get promoted. Mm-hmm. And so in a sense, we're kind of validating that in this group by saying, look, if women are, the feedback that they're getting is, hey, you're well organized and you have a bubbly personality, blah, blah, blah. You're like, okay, well, that's feedback, but how is that going to help me get promoted to be the VP of this org 5 years down the road?
Right.
It doesn't.
Right.
So how do we change these things in a way where men and women are getting similar types of feedback, right? that is constructive, that is helpful for them to actually grow in their careers, is really what we're trying to get at.
Interesting. Fascinating stuff. Well, listen, SK, I'm going to wrap it up there. For folks that may want to get in touch with you guys, try out the product, sort of where might you be out and about on the road? Give us some ways that people can get in touch with the team at Zugata.
Yeah, obviously we're going to a bunch of HR, conferences, so look us up there. Check out our website, and if you have any questions, email us at info@zugata.com, and one of us will get back to you as quickly as we can.
Very cool. Well, listen, this has been really, really interesting insight. I think we touched on a bunch of things, and I suspect we'll have a lot of people kind of curious as to how this impacts them in terms of building their AI stack, or even just building better culture in their company. So it was fun to talk about both the business side and the technology side. And folks, with that, I'm going to wrap it up for SK and for Aaron. Thank you all for listening, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more podcasts, show notes, and everything social media. And visit acloud.guru for all your cloud training needs.